Thomas Gardner stood in the gravel lot of Riverside Pottery Works with $430 in cash in the kind of desperation that makes sensible men do foolish things. The building rose 2 stories against the North Carolina sky, its red brick stained white by decades of kiln smoke and clay dust, and every broken window reflected November clouds moving fast enough to remind him that time was a luxury he'd run out of weeks ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His daughter Maya sat in their car, 9 years old and quiet in the way children become when they've watched their parents lose jobs and apartments and the ability to pretend everything will work out fine. The county tax auction had lasted 11 minutes. Thomas had been the only bidder willing to take on a condemned pottery works with structural issues, kiln damage, and the kind of liability that made insurance agents laugh before hanging up. $430, the auctioneer had announced with the apologetic tone reserved for selling disasters to desperate people, sold to the gentleman who clearly hasn't consulted an engineer or his common sense. Thomas had withdrawn his last $500 from the bank that morning, kept $70 for gas and food, and gambled the rest on a building that everyone in 3 counties knew was worthless. His landlord had given him 10 days to clear out of the rental house after the construction company laid him off, said the property was needed for family, though Thomas suspected it was more about the 4 months of unpaid rent. His applications to every contractor and warehouse within driving distance had generated the kind of silence that spoke louder than rejection, and his ex-wife's lawyer had sent another notice about child support arrears that Thomas kept folded in his wallet because looking at it made his chest tight. The Pottery Works had appeared in the legal notices between foreclosure sales and equipment auctions. County seizure for delinquent taxes, minimum bid $400, property sold as is with all structural defects and environmental concerns. Thomas had driven past it 3 times before gathering the nerve to walk the perimeter, Maya working on spelling homework in the passenger seat while her father studied a building that looked like it was held together by rust and fading paint. The structure had good bones, Thomas told himself, which was what broke men said about buildings that had nothing else going for them. But the bones were real, load-bearing walls 3 feet thick, timber joists from old-growth yellow pine that didn't exist anymore, and a foundation that had withstood 100 years of Carolina heat without cracking. The roof needed work, the windows were gone, and the interior was probably a disaster of broken kilns and decades of accumulated clay dust. But it was space, more square footage than Thomas had ever owned, and with enough work it might become something that generated income, storage maybe, workshops, anything that wasn't sleeping in their car. "Dad, it smells funny," Maya said as Thomas worked the key the county clerk had given him, a woman who'd processed his payment with the efficient sympathy of someone who'd watched too many desperate people throw money at impossible properties. "Old clay and kiln smoke," Thomas said, though the smell was more complex than that, earthenware gone to powder, glazes crystallized on every surface, and organic matter that had been decaying in sealed spaces for decades. The door opened onto a loading area where potters had once delivered finished wares, wooden pallets still stacked against walls marked with decades of clay residue. The main floor stretched into shadows that swallowed his flashlight beam after 30 feet. Equipment rose like monuments to obsolete craft, potters' wheels the size of small cars, their surfaces crusted with dried clay, massive kilns that looked like industrial ovens, and shelving systems that traced paths through the space in patterns that spoke of efficiency refined over generations. Pottery shards littered the floor, fragments of plates and bowls and decorative pieces that had shattered and been left where they fell. "Can we live here?" Maya asked, her voice carrying that particular quality children develop when they know the answer but need to hear their parents say it anyway. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it's ours." Thomas played his light over abandoned workstations, noting details that told stories of the building's last days. Time cards still hung in racks near what must have been the foreman's office, names and dates marking shifts that ended when the bank foreclosed in 1992. Clay-covered aprons hung from hooks, stiff with age. Work tools lay scattered across tables, exactly where they'd been set down 30 years ago. The second floor held the actual pottery studios, spaces where craftspeople had shaped clay into functional and decorative pieces. Potter's wheels lined the walls, some still holding half-formed vessels that had dried and cracked over decades. Glazing stations showed jars of chemicals that had separated into layers, and drying racks held pieces that would never be fired, frozen in states of near completion. The administrative offices occupied a mezzanine level overlooking the main floor. Sample catalogs lined shelves, showing pottery designs from decades past. Order books displayed customer names and quantities that told the story of a once thriving business. And on the wall in the largest office hung a photograph in a walnut frame, a man in his 60s, dressed in the style of the 1930s, standing before the Pottery Works in trance with his hands resting on a potter's wheel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The brass nameplate read, Samuel Riverside, Master Potter and Proprietor, 1878 to 1951. Who's that? Maya asked, pointing at the stern-faced man whose expression suggested the absolute confidence that came from building something significant from nothing. The person who started this place. A long time ago. Thomas explored further, finding stairs to what appeared to be executive offices on the mezzanine's upper level. The largest belonged to Samuel Riverside himself, a desk made from cherry wood that had survived better than anything else in the building, chairs upholstered in leather that had cracked but not collapsed, and windows overlooking the Haw River that had provided water for the pottery operation. The desk still held evidence of interrupted routine. A ledger lay open to pages filled with elegant handwriting. A fountain pen sat in its holder, dried ink crusted at the nib. And on the wall behind the desk hung an oil portrait of the same man from the photograph, older here, perhaps in his 70s, painted with the formality that successful craftsmen commission to ensure their legacy would be remembered. "Dad, I'm thirsty," Maya said, tugging at his jacket. Thomas checked his phone, surprised to see they'd been inside for nearly 3 hours. The November afternoon was fading, and he needed to figure out where they'd sleep tonight since the rental house was already locked and the Pottery Works was legally uninhabitable. "Yeah, sweetheart. Let's go find something to drink." As he turned toward the door, his boot caught on something and he stumbled, catching himself against the desk. Looking down, he saw a floorboard that had come loose, revealing a cavity beneath. And in that cavity, barely visible in the failing light, was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its surface carved with intricate designs. Thomas knelt and extracted it carefully, surprised by its weight. The box was sealed with a brass latch that opened with gentle pressure, revealing contents wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture and time. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, and tucked into its pages was a folded document that looked like architectural plans. The notebook's first page bore a date, October 15, 1950, in an inscription in the same elegant hand as the ledger, "To whoever discovers this, I am Samuel Riverside, Master Potter and Proprietor of this works. What you have found is merely the beginning of what remains concealed within these walls." The economic collapse and changing tastes destroyed many craftsmen's fortunes, but I learned from others' failures and kept my most valuable work close, hidden in ways that will require both skill and understanding to uncover. This building contains pieces I created over 60 years, works I considered too precious to sell or too valuable to trust to the market. I leave this notebook as proof and invitation. The map enclosed will guide you to treasures, but only if you possess the insight to interpret it correctly. Many will own this building after my death, but few will understand what it truly holds. May you prove worthy of the discovery. Samuel Riverside. Thomas read the passage 3 times, his pulse accelerating with each reading. A master potter's hidden collection, concealed within a building everyone assumed was worthless. The box held only this notebook and the map, but if Riverside was telling the truth, there were actual treasures, valuable ceramic pieces hidden somewhere in this structure. He unfolded the architectural plans, finding they showed the Pottery Works in remarkable detail, every floor, every room, every structural element documented with craftsman's precision. Certain locations were marked with blue ink, 8 of them total, each annotated with cryptic phrases and measurements. One notation read, "Where clay first touched water, the cornerstone remembers craft." Another said, "In the kiln's heart, beneath the primary chamber, foundations hold heat and treasure." The clues were maddeningly vague and tantalizingly specific in equal measure. "What is it?" Maya asked, peering at the notebook with curiosity that hadn't yet been beaten down by their circumstances. Thomas looked at his daughter, at the shoes with soles wearing through, at the jacket she'd outgrown but they couldn't afford to replace, at the trust in her eyes that said she still believed her father could fix things even when Thomas barely believed it himself. He thought about the $430 he'd just spent on a condemned building, about the 10 days until homelessness became official, about the arithmetic of single fatherhood that never quite added up to survival. And he thought about Samuel Riverside, a man who'd built a reputation on clay and craftsmanship, who'd survived the Depression by hiding his most valuable work where others wouldn't think to look, who'd left a map for someone desperate or perceptive enough to follow. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "I just found a reason to hope things might actually work out." He returned the notebook to the box and slipped it into his jacket, folded the architectural plans carefully and put them in his back pocket, and led Maya back through the Pottery Works toward daylight. The building felt different now, not abandoned but dormant, like something waiting to be understood by someone who knew how to look. Every shadow held possibility, every structural detail potential significance. They emerged into the parking lot as the sun touched the western hills, painting the Haw River in shades of amber and rust. Thomas looked back at the Pottery Works, at 2 stories of brick and history and supposedly hidden treasures, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with fear in proportions that made his hands shake. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Rachel, asking when she could expect this month's support payment. He'd been avoiding her calls for 3 weeks, had no answer that wouldn't sound like excuses or lies. But standing in front of a building that allegedly contained a master potter's valuable collection, Thomas had something approaching a direction if not quite a plan. He texted back, "Soon. Working on something." Maya climbed into the car, buckling herself with the automatic efficiency of a child who'd learned independence earlier than childhood should require, and Thomas sat in the driver's seat with Riverside's map spread across the steering wheel. The architectural plans showed every detail of the Pottery Works construction, and the blue markings indicated locations throughout the building, each with its cryptic clue. One location referenced the loading area where they'd entered. Another indicated the main pottery floor. Several marked the basement, which Thomas hadn't even known existed. The clues suggested Riverside had hidden his collection systematically, distributed throughout the structure in ways that would require searching, thinking, understanding the building's logic and the craft it had housed. Thomas started the car, knowing he needed to find them somewhere to sleep, but his mind was already working through the puzzle. A master potter's hidden collection in a condemned Pottery Works, protected by riddles written in craftsman's language. It was insane. It was probably fantasy. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble a broke father with a daughter to feed might be crazy enough to believe in. As he pulled onto the county road, Thomas made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would solve Samuel Riverside's puzzle, find whatever the old potter had hidden, and turn their impossible situation into something resembling stability. The Pottery Works had sold for almost nothing because everyone assumed it was worth exactly that. But Thomas knew better now. Sometimes the most valuable things were the ones everyone else had stopped looking for, hidden in plain sight by someone who understood that true worth wasn't always visible on the surface. The building receded in his rearview mirror, 2 stories of possibility against the darkening North Carolina sky, and Thomas Gardner drove toward an uncertain night with a map to hidden treasure in his pocket and the weight of impossible hope settling in his chest like clay waiting to be shaped into something that might, if he was careful and lucky and desperate enough, actually hold water. Thomas spent their first night in the Pottery Works illegally, spreading sleeping bags on the least dusty section of the mezzanine office. Maya curled against him while November wind whistled through broken windows and carried the smell of old clay and kiln residue. The building creaked around them, timber contracting in the cold, ancient equipment settling under weight it had carried since before World War II. Every sound made Thomas question whether he'd crossed from desperation into delusion, but morning came anyway, pale light filtering through clay-dusted windows, and Maya woke asking what was for breakfast with the resigned pragmatism of a child who'd learned that adults rarely had good answers anymore. They ate gas station pastries and drank water from a bottle Thomas had filled at a rest stop, and he studied Riverside's map while Maya explored the office with instructions not to touch anything sharp or unstable, which was essentially everything. The first marked location referenced where clay first touched water. The cornerstone remembers craft. Thomas knew enough about pottery operations to understand that meant the preparation area, the ground floor section where raw clay had been mixed with water before being shaped. The cornerstone was massive, carved granite inscribed with the Pottery Works founding date and Riverside's name in letters that had weathered 70 years of Carolina weather. Thomas examined it carefully, running his hands over the surface, searching for anything that felt loose or deliberately modified. The stone was solid, immovable, and after an hour of searching he found nothing except cold hands and the growing suspicion that he'd spent his last money chasing a dead man's fantasy. He was still searching when his phone rang, Rachel's name on the screen. Thomas almost didn't answer, but avoiding her had never made anything better, only postponed the collision he knew was inevitable. "Where are you?" Rachel's voice carried the particular edge she reserved for conversations about his failures. "I called your landlord. She says you moved out 3 days ago without notice." "We're fine. Found a place." "What place?" "Thomas, you're 5 months behind on support, you haven't had work since August, and now you've moved without telling me where my daughter is staying?" Her voice shifted, anger giving way to something that might have been actual fear. "I'm not trying to make your life harder. But you need to be realistic. If you can't provide stable housing, maybe Maya should stay with me and Eric for a while." The words hit like a fist to the sternum. Rachel had remarried 7 months ago, moved into Eric's house with its finished basement and its school district ranked in the state's top 5. She could provide everything Thomas couldn't: stability, resources, a future that didn't depend on finding a dead potter's hidden collection. And family courts favored stability, favored mothers, favored anything that looked more secure than a broke father sleeping in a condemned building. "No," Thomas said, the word coming out harder than he intended. "She stays with me. Then prove you can take care of her. Stable housing, reliable income, proper schooling. You have 1 week, Thomas. After that, I'm filing for emergency custody modification." The call ended, and Thomas sat among the clay dust with 1 week to transform his life from desperate gamble into something that resembled responsible parenting. He could sell the Pottery Works, probably get a couple thousand for the salvage rights and scrap materials, use that to rent something acceptable and buy time to find work. But selling meant giving up on Riverside's collection, meant accepting that he'd spent his last dollars on nothing. He climbed back upstairs to find Maya standing at a window, looking down at the parking lot where a Lexus SUV had pulled in, expensive and incongruous against the Pottery Works' industrial decay. A woman in her 60s emerged, well-dressed in the casual way that spoke of old money, and stood examining the building with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. "Who's that?" Maya asked. "I don't know." "Stay here." Thomas descended quickly, emerging from the Pottery Works entrance as the woman finished her inspection. She looked up when Thomas appeared, unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting to find someone. "You must be Gardner," the woman said. "I'm Helen Riverside. Samuel was my grandfather." Thomas's mind raced, calculating implications and threats. "I bought this property legally. County auction, paid in full. I'm aware. I'm the one who stopped fighting the tax liens." Helen moved closer, her eyes scanning the building's facade with something that looked like complicated grief. "My family's been trying to divest this property for 30 years. Tax burden, maintenance impossibility, liability concerns that terrified our insurance company. But my father, Samuel's son, he always insisted we keep it. Said there were obligations, things that mattered, family responsibilities we couldn't ignore. He died 5 months ago, and I finally convinced my siblings to let it go. So what do you want? To know what you found." Helen gestured at the building, at the windows Thomas had been examining. "My grandfather was a brilliant craftsman and a complicated man. Built a reputation during the arts and crafts movement, supposedly lost everything in the Depression, then somehow rebuilt through methods that were never entirely clear. Family stories about valuable pieces hidden in the pottery works, collections secured against creditors and tax collectors. But if they existed, we never found them. Searched this place exhaustively over the years, hired appraisers, even brought in structural engineers to check for hidden spaces. Nothing. Thomas kept his expression neutral. It's just an old pottery works. Broken equipment and clay dust. But not only that. Helen's expression hardened. I can see it in your posture, the way you're standing. You found something. And legally speaking, there's a legitimate question about whether artworks deliberately hidden by the original owner to avoid taxation or creditor claims belong to the property's new purchaser or to the original owner's heirs. I bought the building and everything in it. That's how property sales work. Unless the items were concealed with fraudulent intent or hidden in ways that suggest they weren't part of the property's inherent value. Helen pulled out her phone. I have attorneys who specialize in estate disputes and art recovery law. We can do this cooperatively, split whatever you found, or we can do it through the courts while you explain to Child Protective Services why you're raising a child in a condemned building. The threat was clear, and Thomas felt the familiar rage that came from being cornered by people with more resources and better lawyers. But beneath the rage was calculation, the survivor's arithmetic he'd learned through years of barely managing. Your grandfather left a notebook, Thomas said finally. Hidden in his office. Locations marked throughout the building where he stored valuable pieces. I haven't found anything yet except the notebook itself. Helen's careful composure cracked slightly, showing hunger beneath the practiced neutrality. Show me. They climbed to the mezzanine office, Maya watching warily from the corner as Thomas spread Riverside's architectural plans on the desk. Helen studied them with the intensity of someone seeing prophecy confirmed, her finger tracing the blue markings, reading the cryptic notations her grandfather had written decades ago. He actually did it, Helen said quietly. The stubborn old craftsman actually hid his best work in the structure. She looked up at Thomas. Here's what I propose. We search together, split what we find 60-40. I get the larger share because it was my grandfather's work, you get enough to make this worth your considerable effort and risk. 50-50 or I do it myself. You don't have time to do it yourself. Your ex-wife just gave you 1 week to prove stability, which you can't do while living in a condemned building searching for pottery that might not exist. You need money immediately, and you need help navigating the legal complications of art recovery claims. Helen's expression softened fractionally. I'm not trying to rob you, Gardner. I'm offering partnership when I could just as easily destroy you through legal channels and code enforcement complaints. Thomas looked at his daughter, at the sleeping bags in the corner that constituted their current home, at the impossible situation he'd bought for $430. Helen Riverside had resources, connections, could probably smooth over complications Thomas didn't even fully understand yet. But partnership meant splitting the collection's value, meant giving up control, meant trusting someone whose grandfather had been cunning enough to hide valuable work for 70 years. 60-40 in my favor, Thomas said finally. My building, my discovery, my risk. Helen considered, then nodded. Agreed. But we start immediately. Every day that passes is a day closer to your custody hearing and county condemnation. They worked through the morning and into afternoon, following Riverside's map to the marked locations. Thomas had been searching the cornerstone all wrong, looking at the stone itself when the clue said the cornerstone remembers craft. Helen suggested the clay preparation area beside it, and when they examined the floor carefully, they found a section that sounded hollow when tapped. Prying up the boards revealed a sealed container, and inside were ceramic pieces wrapped in cloth that had protected them for decades. Thomas unwrapped the first piece carefully and felt his breath catch. It was a vase, perhaps 14 inches tall, decorated with a glaze technique he'd never seen before, colors that seemed to shift in the light, blues and greens that looked like the ocean at different depths. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every line perfect, the balance flawless. Crystalline glaze, Helen said quietly, examining the piece with obvious emotion. My grandfather spent decades perfecting the technique. These pieces were considered some of his finest work. She carefully unwrapped others, revealing bowls and plates and decorative pieces that shared the same extraordinary quality. They found 8 pieces in the first cache, and Helen was already making calculations, pulling up auction records on her phone for similar work. Conservative estimate, these 8 pieces are worth $40,000 to $60,000. Maybe more if we can authenticate them properly and find the right buyers. Thomas sat on the dusty floor with a fortune in ceramic art surrounding him and felt tears threatening for the first time since the construction company had closed. Helen was already planning, talking about authentication experts and specialty auction houses, but Thomas was thinking about Rachel's ultimatum and whether $40,000 was enough to prove he could provide for Maya. They were still cataloging when Thomas heard footsteps on the stairs, official and measured. He looked up to see a county code enforcement officer in a reflective vest entering the main floor, clipboard in hand. "Buildings condemned," the officer called up. "You can't be in here." Thomas and Helen descended quickly. The officer, whose name tag read Patterson, Code Enforcement, examined them with the weary suspicion of someone who dealt with too many trespassers in dangerous buildings. "I'm the owner," Thomas said, producing the deed. "Bought it at auction 4 days ago." Patterson examined the paperwork, then looked at Thomas with something approaching pity. "You know it's condemned, right? Can't occupy it legally. And we've had a complaint about a child being seen here, which triggers mandatory reporting to social services." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Who complained?" Patterson shrugged. "Anonymous. But if you're living here with a minor, that's a problem. Building's structurally questionable, lacks basic habitability standards. I'm required to file a report. We're not living here. I was just showing someone the property. Your car's been parked here 3 nights according to the complaint. And I can see sleeping bags through that window." Patterson gestured toward the mezzanine. "Look, I'm not trying to make your life harder. But I have to follow protocol. You've got 48 hours to clear out anything personal, after that the building gets posted with no entry orders. And child services will be contacted about your living situation." They left, and Thomas stood in the parking lot with Patterson's card in his hand and the world collapsing around him. 48 hours to clear out. Child services investigation. Rachel's custody petition. And somewhere in this building, supposedly 7 more caches of valuable pottery that he now had less than 2 days to find. "We work through the night," Helen said, her voice carrying command rather than suggestion. "Every piece we can find in the next 48 hours is money toward proving you can provide stable housing." They worked with desperate intensity, following Riverside's map to the second marked location in the main pottery floor. The clue referenced the kiln's heart, beneath the primary chamber, which led them to the largest of the kilns. Using crowbars and determination that bordered on reckless, they pried open an access panel to find another cache, more ceramic pieces, some larger than the first collection, including a massive platter decorated with a landscape scene that took Thomas's breath away. The third location nearly killed them. It was in the basement, which they accessed through a trapdoor Thomas hadn't noticed before. The space was partially flooded with groundwater, and Thomas had to wade through it while Helen held a flashlight from the stairs. The cache was in a waterproof chest embedded in the foundation wall, containing pieces that represented decades of Riverside's work, including some experimental forms that Helen said had been thought lost. By midnight they'd found 5 of the 8 caches, and Helen's running total had reached $200,000, possibly more depending on authentication and market conditions. Thomas's 60% would be over $120,000, more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to prove to any judge that he could provide for Maya. But as they hauled the 5th container up from the basement, both exhausted and soaked, Thomas noticed something he'd missed in his earlier excitement. Several pieces in the waterproof chest weren't signed by Riverside. The marks on the bottom showed different names, other potters, and when Thomas examined them more carefully by flashlight, his stomach turned. Mixed in with Riverside's work were pieces by other craftspeople, valuable works that shouldn't have been in his collection. And tucked into the container was a ledger, water-damaged but readable, showing purchases that didn't match the piece's documented provenance. "What is it?" Helen asked, seeing Thomas's expression change. Thomas showed her the ledger, watching Helen's face shift from curiosity to something harder to define. The ledger documented systematic acquisition of works from other potters during the Depression, pieces bought for pennies on the dollar from desperate craftspeople, then held and later sold under Riverside's name or kept hidden entirely. He was buying from people who were starving, Thomas said, reading the entries by flashlight. Paying them almost nothing for pieces worth hundreds, sometimes thousands. Then either claiming them as his own work or hiding them entirely. They sat in the contaminated basement surrounded by valuable ceramics and documented exploitation, and the weight of what they'd discovered felt suddenly much heavier than the pottery itself. "We can leave these pieces out," Helen said after a long silence. "Focus on the works that are legitimately his. Nobody benefits from exposing how he acquired the others." But Thomas was thinking about his own grandfather, a carpenter who'd worked through the Depression and talked about how employers had taken advantage of desperate men, paying them almost nothing because they had no choice but to accept. About the craftspeople whose names filled this ledger, whose work had been stolen through exploitation disguised as commerce. "Your grandfather left something else," Thomas said, pulling out Riverside's notebook and opening it to a page he'd noticed earlier but hadn't fully processed. An entry from 1950, year before he died. Helen read aloud, "To whoever finds my collection, know that not all of it was created by my hands, and not all of it was acquired with honor. I tell myself that business during the Depression required such practices, that survival justified taking advantage of others' desperation. But at the end of my life, I wonder if a legacy built partly on others' suffering can ever be claimed with pride. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours. Use it wisely or poorly, but know that you cannot claim innocence about the source." They sat in silence, the ledger spread between them like an accusation, and Thomas understood that Samuel Riverside had left more than hidden pottery. He'd left a test, a question about whether someone desperate enough to search for valuable ceramics was honest enough to acknowledge where some of them came from. "We still need the money," Helen said finally. "My grandfather's sins don't change the fact that you need to prove you can house your daughter, and I'd like to recover something from a property that's been a financial drain for decades." "But we'd know," Thomas said. "Every time we sold a piece, we'd know some of them came from exploiting desperate craftspeople. Every valuable collection has uncomfortable origins if you look hard enough. At least we're being honest about it." Thomas looked up at the ceiling, imagining Maya sleeping in the office above them, trusting her father to make decisions that would shape her future. Dawn was starting to filter through cracks in the foundation, and in a few hours Patterson would return to post his no-entry orders and file his mandatory reports to Child Services. "There are 3 more caches," Thomas said, standing and wiping groundwater from his hands. "Your grandfather's map shows them. But one of them has a notation I didn't understand until now." He pulled out the architectural plans, pointing to a location marked on the upper mezzanine. "It says, 'Where truth waits in clay, choices reveal character.' I think he left something else up there, something that explains why he documented his own exploitation instead of destroying the evidence." They climbed through the Pottery Works as dawn broke over North Carolina, 2 people carrying valuable ceramics in moral complexity in equal measure, searching for answers that a dead potter had left in a building everyone else had abandoned as worthless. And outside, Alexis and a beat-up car sat side by side in the parking lot, waiting to carry away either salvation or something much more complicated than either of them was ready to face. The location marked "Where Truth Waits in Clay" was in the building's attic storage, a space Thomas hadn't known existed until Helen pointed out a narrow stairway hidden behind a false wall panel on the upper mezzanine. They climbed in silence, the wooden steps protesting under their weight, and emerged into a low-ceilinged room that ran half the length of the building, lit only by gaps where roof boards had rotted away over the years. At the far end, beneath the most intact section of roof, sat a wooden crate larger than all the others. Unlike the previous caches, this one wasn't sealed or hidden. It sat in plain view, waiting, with an envelope propped against it bearing a single word in Samuel Riverside's elegant handwriting: accountability. Thomas opened the envelope while Helen examined the crate. Inside was a letter, dated November 1950, written in the shaky hand of a man who knew his time was ending, To the finder of my collection, if you have come this far, you have found the pottery I created and the pieces I acquired from others. You have also found, if you searched honestly, the ledger documenting how I purchased some of those works during the Depression, paying desperate craftspeople almost nothing for pieces worth far more. The crate before you contains something more valuable than ceramic art, documentation of the craftspeople whose work I acquired and whose families might still deserve compensation. You will find their names, their original asking prices, and what I actually paid. You will find evidence that could bring claims against my estate even now, decades after my death. I could have destroyed these records. I should have. But at the end of my life, I find I cannot die without leaving some accounting, some possibility that the wrongs I committed might be addressed by someone with more courage than I possessed. The collection is yours if you want it. But so is the choice of what to do with this knowledge. You can destroy it and enjoy the profits without the burden of its origins. Or you can do something I lack the integrity to do, acknowledge the exploitation, seek out the descendants, and use the proceeds to make what restitution is possible. I do not tell you which to choose. I only tell you that the choice will define you more surely than the pottery ever could. Samuel Riverside Thomas read the letter twice, then handed it to Helen, who read it with an expression that moved from confusion to something that might have been grief or might have been relief. They opened the crate together and found exactly what Riverside had promised, decades of documentation showing purchases from 23 different craftspeople, noting the fair market value of their work versus what he'd actually paid, calculating a total theft of over $50,000 in Depression-era money. Jesus, Helen said quietly. He kept records of everyone he cheated. Thomas looked at the documents, at the names of potters whose families might still be in North Carolina, might still remember grandparents who sold their best work for nothing because they had no other choice. He thought about his own grandfather, about the particular bitterness the old man had carried about being taken advantage of during hard times, about dying with more regret than savings despite a lifetime of skilled labor. "What do you want to do?" Helen asked. Before Thomas could answer, his phone rang. Rachel's number. He answered, already bracing for another ultimatum. "Child Services called me," she said without preamble. "They said you're living in a condemned building with Maya." "Thomas, what the hell are you thinking?" "I'm coming to get her right now. This ends today." "Rachel, wait, no more waiting. I'll be at that pottery works in 2 hours with Eric and my attorney. You can hand her over voluntarily or we can involve the police." She hung up. Thomas sat heavily on the attic floor, the weight of the past 4 days finally crushing down. Helen stood nearby, clearly uncertain what to say to a man watching his life collapse in real time. "How much is my share worth?" Thomas asked finally. "Best estimate, including everything we found. Based on authentication and market research, your 60% would be around $130,000. Enough to rent a decent place, pay your support arrears, prove financial stability. And if we tried to find the craftspeople's descendants? Make actual restitution for what your grandfather stole?" Helen was quiet for a long moment. "It would consume most of the collection's value. My grandfather's own accounting says he underpaid by the equivalent of $300,000 in today's money. We don't have enough to make full restitution even if we sold everything. But we could try. We could acknowledge what happened and use what we have to at least partially address it. You'd be giving up the money that could save your custody situation." Thomas looked at the documents spread across the attic floor, at the evidence of exploitation that had allowed Riverside to build his collection. He thought about Maya sleeping downstairs, about what he wanted to teach his daughter about integrity and choices and what mattered when everything else was falling apart. "There's another option," Helen said slowly. "We take the collection, but we establish something. Use the proceeds to create opportunities for contemporary craftspeople. Not direct restitution, which would be impossible to calculate fairly after 70 years, but something that serves the craft community and acknowledges what was taken." "Like what?" "The pottery works itself. We restore it properly, but instead of selling it or using it for profit, we turn it into something that provides opportunity. Artist residency program, maybe. Affordable studio space for potters. Something that generates value for craftspeople rather than extracting it from them. Thomas considered this, the idea taking shape in his mind. That would take most of the collection's proceeds just for building restoration. Most but not all. You could keep enough to satisfy your immediate needs, prove to the court you're stable, and still do something meaningful with the rest. And you'd go along with this? Give up your 40% for a community program? Helen looked around the attic, at the building her grandfather had filled with beauty and theft in equal measure. My family's been trying to walk away from this place for 30 years. Maybe instead of walking away, we should walk toward something. Use Riverside's collection to create something he never had the decency to build, a legacy that actually supports craftspeople rather than exploiting them. They spent the next hour making calculations and phone calls. Helen had connections to arts foundations and historic preservation groups. Thomas had nothing but desperation and a building full of valuable pottery. But together they sketched the outline of something that might work: authenticate and sell the collection through proper channels, use 75% for building restoration and program establishment, split the remaining 25% between them. Thomas's share would be around $32,000. Enough to rent a house, pay Rachel what he owed, buy time to find actual work. Not the fortune he'd imagined when finding Riverside's notebook, but enough to prove he wasn't drowning anymore. When Rachel arrived with her attorney and Eric, Thomas met them in the parking lot. Maya was with him, and Helen stood nearby with a folder full of documentation they'd prepared. "We're not doing this here," Rachel's attorney began, but Thomas held up his hand. "I'm not fighting you. You're right. I haven't been able to provide stability. But I am now." He handed her bank documentation showing the deposit from his share of the collection's advance sale, a signed lease for a house in town, and proof of enrollment for Maya at the local school starting Monday. Rachel examined the papers with obvious suspicion. "Where did this money come from?" "I found something valuable in the building. Ceramic collection. Authenticated it with experts, sold it through proper channels with legal documentation." Thomas gestured to Helen. "This is Helen Riverside. Her grandfather built this pottery works and left a collection hidden here. We've been working with attorneys and auction houses to properly authenticate and liquidate the pieces." Eric spoke for the first time, his lawyer voice assessing the situation. "And the building itself? You're still living in a condemned pottery works." "No. I signed a lease this morning. We move in this weekend. The pottery works is being restored and converted to an artist residency program. I'll be managing the project, which provides employment and steady income." Rachel's attorney examined the documentation, clearly searching for problems but finding none. The bank statements were legitimate, the lease was proper, and the employment contract with the newly established Riverside Craft Legacy Foundation was legally executed. "Can I talk to you alone?" Rachel asked Thomas. They walked toward the Hall River that ran behind the property. Rachel stood looking at the water for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't want to take her from you. I wanted you to succeed. To be the father you should be. I know. What really happened? For days ago you had nothing. Now you have money and a house and a job." Thomas considered how much truth to share. "I bought a condemned building with my last $400 because I was desperate and stupid. Found out the original owner had hidden valuable pottery throughout the structure. Enough that when we authenticated and sold it properly, I got a share. Not enough to be rich, but enough to be stable. And you're using most of it for this artist program thing? Most of it belongs to other people. The craftspeople whose work was stolen during the Depression. The money came from that exploitation. Helen and I decided using it to support contemporary craftspeople was better than just keeping it." Rachel studied him, looking for the desperate edge that had characterized him for months. "You look different. Like you can actually breathe." "I can. First time in a long time." She nodded slowly. "I'm not withdrawing the petition entirely. But I'm not pursuing emergency custody either. We'll work out a regular schedule, make sure Maya has stability with both of us. But Thomas, if you slip back, if you can't maintain this, I won't hesitate. I understand. And thank you. The restoration took longer than projected, cost more than budgeted, and required Thomas to learn more about historic preservation than he'd ever wanted to know. But the work was real, paid actual wages, and gave him purpose beyond simple survival. Helen became an unlikely partner, her foundation connections and legal knowledge complementing Thomas's growing expertise in building management and arts programming. They established a board for the Riverside Craft Legacy Foundation, including descendants of craftspeople whose names appeared in Samuel Riverside's exploitation ledgers. The mission was simple: acknowledge the exploitation that had helped build the collection, use the proceeds from that collection to restore the building, and create opportunities for contemporary craftspeople who needed support. The pottery pieces sold for more than Helen's initial estimates. Authentication revealed that several were even more significant than they'd realized, including works by craftspeople who'd later become renowned but whose early pieces had been thought lost. After restoration costs, they had enough remaining to establish the residency program and create an endowment for ongoing operations. Maya turned 10 during the first year of restoration, celebrated her birthday in a building still under construction, her friends exploring spaces that were becoming something new. Thomas watched his daughter navigate the Pottery Works with confidence, explaining the building's history and transformation to her classmates, and understood that Maya was learning lessons about integrity and legacy that couldn't be taught through words alone. The grand opening happened on a September afternoon 16 months after Thomas had bought the Pottery Works for $430. 150 people attended, including descendants of craftspeople Riverside had exploited, contemporary potters who'd received residencies, and community members who'd watched the building decay for 30 years. Thomas stood in the renovated main floor, surrounded by potter's wheels that were now functional rather than relics, by spaces that would house resident artists and community workshops and educational programming. He felt the particular satisfaction that comes from building something that wouldn't have existed without desperation and luck and the willingness to choose integrity over expedience. Helen found him near the memorial display, where visitors were reading Samuel Riverside's final letter and examining the exploitation documentation they'd chosen to display rather than hide. Strange thing, making a monument to your grandfather's theft. Better than pretending it didn't happen, Thomas said. He left us that choice. We made it. You made it. I just followed your lead. You could have fought me. Could have insisted we keep the money and destroy the evidence. Helen looked at her grandfather's portrait, now displayed with full context about both his artistic achievements and his exploitation of fellow craftspeople. I spent my whole life proud of the Riverside name. Now I don't know what to be proud of. Be proud that you didn't hide the truth. That you helped build this. Your grandfather created beauty partly through exploiting desperate craftspeople. We're using the proceeds from that beauty to create opportunity without exploitation. That's not redemption for him, but it's something for us. The Riverside Craft Legacy Center opened with 12 artist residencies, 2 community pottery programs, and educational workshops that served the entire region. Revenue from classes and sales covered maintenance and supported ongoing programming, creating a sustainable model that other communities began studying for their own abandoned craft buildings. Thomas took a position as center director, drawing a salary that covered rent and Maya's expenses and slowly rebuilt his savings. The work was constant, coordinating between resident artists and community programs, maintaining a century-old building while keeping it relevant to contemporary craft. But it was work that meant something beyond survival, contribution to something that would outlast him. Rachel's marriage to Eric ended after 2 years, amicable enough that she moved to a house nearby and the custody arrangement evolved into genuine co-parenting rather than managed conflict. She attended center events occasionally, supporting what Thomas had built even if she'd never fully understand how close he'd come to losing everything. On the 2-year anniversary of the center's opening, Thomas stood in the attic where he'd found Samuel Riverside's final letter. The space had been converted to administrative offices, the crate and its damning contents now part of the museum display downstairs. He'd brought Maya up to show her the space where everything had changed. Grandpa would have liked this, Maya said, looking around the renovated attic. He always said craftspeople got taken advantage of, but he'd appreciate someone trying to fix it. Your great-grandfather was a potter? A carpenter, but he talked about Depression times a lot. How employers would pay almost nothing because people were desperate. Thomas felt something settle in his chest, understanding that the exploitation Riverside had practiced wasn't unique, that his own family had experienced similar treatment, that the choice he'd made to acknowledge rather than hide the theft honored more than just Riverside's victims. He descended to the museum display and looked at the craftspeople's names in the ledger, understanding that some of them might have sold work to his great-grandfather too, that the web of Depression-era exploitation connected more people than any individual story could capture. 5 years after buying the Pottery Works, Thomas received a letter from the descendant of one of the craftspeople whose name appeared in Riverside's ledgers. They'd learned about the center, visited the museum, wanted to thank Thomas for acknowledging what had happened to their families and for using the collection's proceeds to support contemporary craftspeople rather than simply profiting from the exploitation. The letter included a photograph of the craftsperson, and Thomas added it to the memorial wall that had grown to fill an entire section of the museum. The wall showed both the exploitation and the response to it, the theft and the attempt at restitution, acknowledging that perfect justice was impossible but partial justice was worth pursuing. Helen stood with Thomas at the wall's expansion ceremony, both older now, the years of managing the center having left their mark. I think about my grandfather's final letter sometimes. About that line where he said the choice would define us more than the pottery. He was right, Thomas said. The collection's mostly gone now, sold to fund this place. But what remains is this center, and the choice we made about what to build with tainted beauty. The center continued operating, not dramatically profitable but sustainable, serving the craft community and teaching about both the art of pottery and the ethics of how art gets made and acquired. Thomas turned 40 managing a building he'd owned for 8 years, surrounded by people who'd built careers and created work in spaces he'd helped restore. On the 10th anniversary of his purchase, Thomas stood at the river overlook they'd built on the property, watching the Haw River flow past. Maya was in college studying art history and nonprofit management, planning to return and help manage the center's next phase. The Pottery Works stood behind him, 2 stories of brick that had witnessed a century of craft and exploitation and transformation. The building breathed with morning activity, resident artists arriving for studio time in spaces that had been abandoned ruins when Thomas first walked through them with $430 and no plan beyond desperate hope. The collection he'd found was gone now, sold to museums and private collectors, the proceeds spent on restoration and programming and the constant cost of maintaining buildings in integrity. But what remained was structure, community, legacy built not on what he'd inherited but on what he'd chosen to do with that inheritance. Thomas understood what he'd bought for $430, not treasure or salvation or security, but the opportunity to make a choice that defined him, to build something from ruins that acknowledged where the beauty came from while creating new beauty without exploitation, to prove that legacy wasn't what you found but what you chose to carry forward and what you had the courage to transform. The river flowed toward the ocean, carrying water that had powered the Pottery Works once and would continue flowing long after the building crumbled despite all efforts to preserve it. But for now, for this generation and hopefully several more, the center stood as testimony that beauty built partly on exploitation could be redirected toward opportunity, that buildings could change purpose, and that sometimes the most valuable thing you could do with found treasure was acknowledge its cost and use it to prevent future harm. The stroke came on a Friday morning in early spring, 18 years after Thomas had first walked through the Pottery Works entrance with nothing but $430 and a daughter's faith. The doctor used words like cerebrovascular accident and rehabilitation timeline, gave instructions about physical therapy and cognitive exercises, and Thomas sat in the examination room thinking not about mortality but about whether Maya knew the kiln firing schedules and if the quarterly grant reports had been submitted to the State Arts Council. Maya came from the nonprofit consulting firm where she now worked as senior program director, brought her husband Daniel with her, and they sat in Thomas's house overlooking the Haw River, the center visible through windows that had framed it for nearly 2 decades. Maya didn't cry the way she had at 9 when they'd slept in a condemned building, but her face showed the particular fear adults carry when they realize their parents are made of time and flesh rather than permanence. The center needs someone who understands why it matters, Thomas said when the initial shock had settled enough for conversation, his speech slurred but his meaning clear. Not just how to run artist programs, but why we built it the way we did. I have a career, Dad. Consulting contracts across 3 states. I can't just drop everything and move back to manage a craft center. I'm not asking you to drop anything. I'm asking you to consider what you want to be responsible for. Thomas gestured toward the window, toward the building standing solid against the spring sky. That place is going to outlast both of us. The question is what it becomes after I'm gone, whether it stays true to what we built or just becomes another arts facility run by people who don't understand the deeper purpose. Daniel, who'd been quiet until now, spoke with the gentle directness Thomas had come to appreciate. What was the deeper purpose? I know it's about acknowledging exploitation and supporting craftspeople, but what drove the specific way you structured everything? Thomas considered the question, his mind working slower since the stroke but still capable of articulating what mattered. We built acknowledgement. The Pottery Works was constructed through craft, but Riverside's collection was built partly through exploiting desperate craftspeople. Everyone wanted to ignore that history, to just celebrate the beauty and forget the cost. We changed it by admitting what happened and using the collection's value to create opportunity instead of just profit. The purpose was proving you can honor craft while being honest about how some of it was acquired. The recovery took months, during which Thomas watched the center's operations from enforced distance, his body weak and his left side uncooperative. Maya and Daniel moved back gradually, Maya restructuring her consulting practice to work from North Carolina while learning the institutional knowledge Thomas had accumulated through 18 years of daily management. Helen visited weekly, now approaching 90 and moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become unreliable but whose mind remained sharp. She brought food Thomas's restricted diet allowed in conversation that avoided the obvious reality that they were both approaching the end of their particular race against time. I've been thinking about my grandfather, Helen said during one visit, sitting in Thomas's living room with the center visible through windows that had become his primary view of the world. Whether he knew someone would make the choices we made, whether that final letter was deliberate moral instruction or just guilt finding expression at the end. Does it matter? I think it does. If he planned it, if he structured the treasure hunt to force ethical reckoning, that suggests some capacity for growth even at life's end. If it was just random guilt, then his exploitation generated consequences he never intended to address. Thomas looked at the center, at brick that had witnessed a century of craft and theft and transformation, that would continue witnessing long after both of them were dust. I think he knew someone would search. The notebook he left, the way he documented both the collection and the exploitation, it was designed to make the finder understand what they were taking. But I don't think he could have predicted exactly what we'd do. How could he? He lived in a world where taking advantage of desperate people was just business. We live in one where we know better even if doing better is still hard. Do you regret it? Using most of the collection's value for the center instead of keeping more for yourself? I regret not teaching Maya the glaze chemistry protocols before the stroke. Those formulas are complex. Helen smiled, but her eyes carried the weight of watching a friend fade. Maya's taking over permanently. She told me yesterday. Restructuring her consulting firm to work from here, accepting the center director position. Says she wants her son to grow up understanding what real legacy means, not just what you inherit but what you choose to build with it. Thomas felt something release in his chest, tension he'd been carrying since the diagnosis. Maya hadn't told him yet, was probably waiting for the right moment, but knowing she'd made that choice mattered more than Thomas could articulate. Legacy would continue not because Thomas had demanded it but because Maya had chosen it, understood what the center represented beyond buildings and programming. The center held a celebration for its 20th anniversary in October, and Thomas attended in a wheelchair, his body too weak for the walking that managing the building had once required but his mind still capable of appreciating the symmetry. Community members spoke about opportunity in craft, about learning from industrial history's complicated legacies. Some were grandchildren of craftspeople whose names appeared in Samuel Riverside's exploitation ledgers, building careers in spaces where their ancestors had been systematically cheated. One speaker, a potter named Saracen, addressed Thomas directly. My great-grandmother sold her best work to Samuel Riverside during the Depression for almost nothing because she was desperate. The ledgers show she got maybe 10% of what the pieces were worth. When I first learned about this place, I was angry that the Riverside family was getting credit for fixing damage they'd caused. But then I came and saw what you built, saw my great-grandmother's name honored instead of hidden, saw the exploitation acknowledged instead of erased. You didn't erase what happened, but you testified to it and used the money from that collection to create something that serves people like me. That matters. Thomas listened and understood that this was the measure of success that truly mattered, not financial sustainability or architectural preservation, but whether people whose ancestors had been harmed felt their pain was acknowledged and their craft was honored. The sender would outlast him, would continue serving craftspeople or fail to, but for this moment it stood as testimony that exploitation could be named and beauty's value could be redirected toward healing. He died in March, as winter released its hold and the Haw River began to swell with spring runoff. Maya was with him, and Helen, and a hospice nurse who'd spent enough time in their company to understand what the sender represented. His last coherent words were about checking the kiln temperature sensors, the mundane concerns of someone who'd spent 18 years maintaining systems that mattered more than comfort or ease. The funeral filled the center's community space with people whose lives had intersected with Thomas's work, resident artists and community potters, arts administrators and foundation officers, county officials and former skeptics, Rachel with her quiet grief for the man she'd loved and left and ultimately respected. Maya spoke about her father's particular brand of stubborn integrity, his refusal to accept that finding tainted treasure meant you had to keep it quietly or that acknowledging harm was less important than personal gain. Helen delivered a eulogy that was really about both Samuel Riverside and Thomas Gardner, about her grandfather's exploitation and Thomas's transformation of it, about how sometimes justice looks less like punishment and more like acknowledgement paired with opportunity, less like erasing history and more like using its proceeds to build something better. My grandfather exploited desperate craftspeople to build a collection he hid in these walls. Thomas found that collection and used its value to create opportunity for contemporary craftspeople. That's not redemption for my grandfather, but it's something meaningful for all of us. They scattered Thomas's ashes in the Haw River at a point where the water reflected pottery studio windows, watching the current carry him downstream toward larger waters. Maya stood with Daniel and their son Jacob beside her, Helen slightly apart, and they were quiet in the way people are when grief is too large for words but too important to ignore. The center stood behind them, 2 stories of brick and history and transformation, windows reflecting clouds that moved with the particular speed that suggests seasons changing. The building had weathered Thomas's death the way it had weathered Samuel Riverside's, the way it would weather Maya's eventual passing, because buildings persist when maintained, outlasting the people who claim to own them while really just temporarily stewarding them. Maya moved into her father's house, not because she needed the space but because the view of the center felt important to maintain. She found Thomas's notebooks documenting 18 years of arts administration and community engagement, discovered the complexity of systems her father had managed while making it look simpler than it was. The kilns did need recalibration, Helen had been right about that, and the maintenance required weeks of coordination with ceramic engineers. The memorial wall grew after Thomas's death, not with more exploitation documentation but with images of people who'd benefited from the center's residencies and workshops, showing transformation alongside acknowledgement, craft flourishing in spaces built on admitted harm. Jacob, Thomas's grandson, grew up treating the center as extended home, learning early that buildings carry histories and that beauty often has complicated origins. He understood before most children that the most important work is acknowledging what came before and choosing to build something honest from it. Helen died at 92, quietly in her sleep, and left her entire estate to the center's endowment with instructions that it be used for maintaining the exploitation memorial and supporting emerging craftspeople who couldn't otherwise afford studio space. Her will included a letter addressed to Maya. My grandfather built beauty partly through exploiting desperate craftspeople. Your father transformed that legacy through acknowledgement and opportunity. I've tried to sustain it through investment and honesty. Now it's your generation's turn to decide what this building and this work becomes. Every generation has that choice. Choose truth over convenience. Always choose testimony over erasure. The seasons turned, marking time in the particular way that matters to rivers and old buildings, in cycles of flood and drought and gradual transformation that outlast individual human drama while being shaped by accumulated human choices. The center stood through storms and budget crises and the constant entropy that claims all construction if someone doesn't care enough to maintain it. Maya cared enough. Marked 25 years of center operation with an event that was really about Thomas, about a man who'd bought a condemned building with his last money and chose integrity over expedience when he found hidden treasure. She spoke to a crowd that included people who'd never met her father but understood what he'd built, about how desperation sometimes leads to discovery and discovery leads to responsibility and responsibility leads to choices that define you more than wealth ever could. My father found a master potter's collection hidden in these walls, Maya said, standing where Thomas had stood at the 20th anniversary. He could have sold it all and disappeared. Instead he chose to acknowledge where it came from, the exploitation that helped build it, and use the proceeds to create something that supports craftspeople rather than extracting from them. That choice defined the rest of his life and shapes how we operate this center today. The museum display had expanded to fill an entire wing, photographs and documents showing both the exploitation Samuel Riverside practiced and the transformation Thomas Gardner chose, demonstrating that legacy isn't what you inherit but what you decide to do with that inheritance. Jacob turned 18 and chose arts administration as his university focus, planning to return and continue the work his grandfather had started. The center had become his inheritance too, not property but responsibility, the obligation to maintain honesty about the past while building towards something better. On the 30th anniversary of Thomas's purchase, Maya stood at the river overlook they'd built on the property, watching the Haw River flow past. The water reflected morning light the same way it had for centuries, patient and persistent, carrying memory downstream. The center hummed behind her with morning activity, resident artists arriving for studio time in spaces that had been abandoned ruins when her father first explored them with $430 and no plan beyond desperate hope. The building breathed with purpose, solid and maintained, proof that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with found treasure is acknowledge its cost and redirect its value toward preventing future harm. Jacob worked in the administrative office now, learning systems his mother had learned from his grandfather, preparing to carry forward a legacy that measured success not in profit but in opportunity created and truth acknowledged. He understood what his grandfather had bought for $430, not treasure or security but the chance to make a choice that would define not just him but everyone who came after. The sun cleared the eastern hills, flooding the valley with light that touched the brick walls the same way it had for over a century. The building had witnessed boom and collapse, craft and exploitation, abandonment and rebirth, and would continue witnessing as long as someone maintained it and understood why it mattered. Maya stood watching the river flow, carrying clay sediment and spring runoff toward the ocean, and understood what her father had known, that legacy wasn't what you found but what you chose to carry forward. Not completion but continuation, not perfection but honest effort towards something better than what came before, sustained across generations by people willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths and build despite them. The Haw River flowed on, patient and timeless, and the Riverside Craft Legacy Center stood beside it, 2 stories of transformation built on a foundation of acknowledged harm, testament to a desperate father's gamble and his choice to value integrity over expedience. Serving craftspeople and teaching each new generation that the most important question isn't what you find but what you choose to do with it once you understand where it came from and what it cost to create. The pottery wheels turned in the studios, shaping new clay into new forms, and the kilns fired at temperatures Samuel Riverside would have recognized, and the river flowed past carrying stories written in water and time, and the building stood witness to it all, breathing with the quiet strength of structures that outlast their builders because someone in each generation chooses to maintain not just the brick and timber but the purpose and the truth that gave them meaning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.